So good afternoon, and thank you so much for coming out to hear an extraordinary presentation filled with great stories, but also a lot of practical detail, I have a feeling. So this event is co-sponsored by International Studies and the Islamic Civilization and Societies program. So thank you to both of them and Professor Owens for joining us in this collaboration. The State Department is a place that is probably exactly what it's cracked up to be. It's exciting, it's travel, it's meeting great people, and we're going to hear just how wonderful that is. It also is very rigorous, and it takes a lot of hard work and a lot of effort, a lot of inspiration and creativity, and it needs a lot of really, really brilliant people. And that's why Boston College should get all the State Department jobs. So we are really fortunate tonight to have three guests, and I'm going to introduce them just very briefly, but then they're going to fill in more of their background and have a conversation, and then we're going to open it up to your questions, right? And then also, Tony, we need some more of those flyers and stickers, so you can just send them to us, and we'll be happy to distribute them. So I'll start with Cheryl. Cheryl Fernandez is Director of the Office of Western Hemisphere Assistance in the State Department's Bureau of Populations, Refugee, and Migrations. Previously, she served as Director of the Office of Policy Coordination in the Bureau of Global Talent Management and Director of the Caucasus Affairs in the Bureau of European and Eurasian Affairs. Tony Fernandez they're related, yes, is Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Trade Policy and Negotiations in the Bureau of Economic and Business Affairs. Previously, he served as Director of the Multilateral Trade Affairs Office in the Bureau of Economic and Business Affairs. He also served as Director for Regional Affairs in the Bureau of Legislative Affairs and Director for Africa and the Middle East in the Bureau of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement. His overseas assignments include positions in Turkey, Nigeria, Russia, Canada, and China. Peter Martin is Special Assistant to Boston College President Father William Leahy. Before coming to BC, he served in the U.S. Embassy to the Holy See, the U.S. Embassy in Warsaw, and as liaison to the UN peacekeeping operations in Bosnia and Kosovo. So please join me in warmly welcoming all three. So maybe we can start with so that little sketch of bios is just scratching the surface. So maybe we could start with a fuller description of what you've done in your career.
Sure. Why don't I start? So I'm the only one up here who's a BC grad. So I was a political science major, similar to you all, trying to figure out what am I going to do with a political science degree. I was interested in international affairs, but at that time, BC didn't have, I would say, as many options as you all as far as languages and overseas opportunities. So at that time, a lot of political science majors went to law school. And so I went to law school. I went to law school at the University of Minnesota. And I went there primarily because they had a human rights center, and I was interested in international human rights law. And so they sent me on a internship when I was in law school, where I went to South Africa. This is a time when South Africa was under apartheid. Nelson Mandela had just been released from prison, and while I was there, the first and only American I met, at a meeting I attended, I asked him what he did, why was he in South Africa, and he told me he worked for the State Department, and he was a Foreign Service officer. And that kind of set, at that stage, kind of put in my brain of, oh, okay, this sounds like a really cool job. He was telling me about living overseas and learning languages and getting to work on diplomacy and really helping people and doing public service. And so I didn't actually join the State Department until much later. I was 29 years old. I completed law school, worked for some NGOs working in Africa, worked also on Capitol Hill. I was a legislative assistant, and then I found the State Department, and it's been great. September is actually the 26th year anniversary of the time that I joined the State Department. Now, Peter and I actually joined at the same time. We met in the initial orientation, and so it's been a great ride. Professor Bailey has noticed some of the places we've worked in. For me, this is a really intellectually stimulating career. For those of you who are looking for adventures, want to learn new languages. I've learned 3 languages, which I didn't know at BC at all. I've learned Russian, Turkish, and Mandarin, and the State Department paid for me to learn those languages. I had I had a salary, and my full-time job was to learn a language. And the State Department also gave me a master's degree from the National War College. I got to work with military folks there, and so it has given me so many different opportunities. It's given me a wife. I met Cheryl in the Foreign Service, and then also a family. So, my journey. I should have mentioned at the beginning. So I'm from Massachusetts. I grew up on Cape Cod and Sandwich, and so was kind of a not local but local area kid who didn't really know that there was so much out there in the world. And so I'm very grateful for the opportunity. Part of why we're here is to let you know about those opportunities. I wish when I was sitting here at BC, I knew about the internships, the scholarships, the fellowships. There are so many opportunities for you to come join us at the State Department in some way. So I'll stop there. I'll turn it over to Cheryl.
So I'm Cheryl Fernandez, yes, part of the same group. I had a little bit different of how I came to the State Department. I'm an Army brat. My dad was in the US military. So I grew up moving around some and was actually born in Germany. I grew up hearing my parents tell these wonderful stories about the time that they had in Germany, and they really enjoyed it. They lived off of the base. They had kind of a very different experience than a lot of folks in the military do. And so I grew up with kind of in the back of my mind that that sounds really fun. I actually was a Russian major in undergrad. When I graduated from college, I knew that I wanted to do something overseas. I really wanted to live and work at that point in the Soviet Union. I am dating myself a little bit there, but I didn't know how I wanted to do that. I went to work at the U.S. Geological Survey, working on their international programs for about 6 years. And while I did that, I was getting my master's in international public policy and found out about the State Department and the Foreign Service, and so then joined. I've been in about 6 months longer than these two is all. We literally we're almost next classes next to each other. And before Tony and I got married, I served in Ecuador and Kazakhstan, and then we've been on our other tours together. I'll turn it over to Peter.
Well, as Tony said, we met in the A100 class, which is the orientation class. And from the beginning, he was giving me a hard time because I went to Georgetown, and he was always telling me BC is better than Georgetown.
That's right.
Little did I know I was going to be working at BC in the future, but so now I've put my Hoya stuff in the back of the closet. No one sees it anymore. I work for Father Leahy, as Professor Bailey was saying. I do various things for him, do some special projects and some international things too, but also teach in international studies with Professor Owens. And a couple of my students are here, actually. They can tell you if my class is good or not. But teach a class on Vatican diplomacy because I served at the Vatican for some years. And we've talked a little bit about possibly doing a class just on the State Department and Foreign Service maybe next year. So, yeah, so my path was a little bit different, I guess. As I say, I went to Georgetown, and Georgetown has a Foreign Service school, but I was in the College of Arts and Sciences. I wasn't really thinking about Foreign Service at that point. I'd never had the chance to travel outside the U.S. until I finished college. At that point, it was, I'll date myself also, it was just when the Berlin Wall had fallen, and there was an opportunity to go teach English in Czechoslovakia at the time. And so I went and taught in Eastern Slovakia. And for me, it was just the most amazing thing to be living overseas, to learn Slovak, My Slovak friends would say, well, kind of learn Slovak, but I learned Slovak to a certain point. And also just get the feeling that, you know, to be a representative of your country overseas, you know, I was the only, I lived in a city of about 300,000, and for most of those people, I was the only American they'd ever met. There weren't any other Americans that I knew of in the city, and so there's, you know, from the beginning of when I lived there, I had a real sense of, you know, that I was representing my country, and I needed to keep that in mind in all my interactions. And so between that, the language, and my family has a history of public service, made me start to think what a great way to combine the excitement of living overseas and public service and join the State Department. So I also, like Tony and Cheryl, I didn't join right away. I did a couple things first. I got a master's degree also at Emory University, but eventually came in, and yeah, I had a great time. I really enjoyed my career. I served back in Washington numerous times, including the Office of the Secretary of State. I also was lucky to be paid by the Foreign Service to learn Polish. I already had some French and some Italian, but I got a little bit of what we call brush up study on those, which was nice. Yeah, it was a really exciting career. My kids grew up overseas partially. One reason that I left, and probably might come out in questions about lifestyle or whatnot, I was having a great time. I really enjoyed it. We had served in numerous places, but at a certain point, my wife, who I met just when I was starting my career, but we had met back in Washington, she said to me, you know, I don't know if I can move anymore. We'd moved, I guess, 11 times since, we'd moved 11 times since I got into the service, I guess 9 times since we had met. And she had worked at the International Monetary Fund when we had first met. She basically gave up that career to travel with me. And although she worked at some embassies here and there, she never wanted to, for various reasons, she never wanted to become a Foreign Service officer, and so we would be a tandem couple like Cheryl and Tony. So it was just tough family-wise. We've been in 23 years, and for the kids too, it was a great experience, but it was also a little difficult moving from place to place, as you can imagine, those of you who might have moved a lot. And so, to make a long story short, there was a good opportunity here at Boston College where I could teach something about diplomacy, and also, I think, further a mission of a great institution. Maybe change my wardrobe, like I said, to BC maroon and gold. But so we decided to come back here, get a little more stability for the kids, and still a lot of my best friends in the Foreign Service. We're in touch all the time, and you know, I do miss it sometimes. But but I think for the family, it was the right time for us to stop.
Yeah, and Cheryl will talk a little bit about kind of the careers and internships, stuff like that.
So Foreign Service, really State Department, there are 2 pathways you can go, and it depends on what kind of lifestyle you want, really. There's Foreign Service, so if you're interested in spending most of your career overseas, maybe coming back doing a tour or 2 in Washington, but spending most of the time overseas, you want to look at Foreign Service. Very much the same types of jobs that we do when we're in DC. There's civil service, which is your typical GS civil service jobs. But in Washington at the State Department, we all do the same type of work, the civil service and Foreign Service. Civil service does have opportunities at various times that they can do one tour as an excursion and go overseas, but really you're focused on Washington, DC. In the Foreign Service, we have generalists, which is what Tony and I and Peter did. We have political officers, economic officers, public diplomacy officers, management officers, and consular officers. So a wide range of skill sets you can do as a generalist. You specialize in one of them, but you also get to move between them. So I've worked in actually all 5 specialties in my career. Tony's worked in several. I think you worked in several as well. We also have a path that's for specialists. The specialist path are really, if you think about the professions that you really need to focus on that core. So we have IT specialists. Overseas, they run our IT systems and keep our cybersecurity in check. They do the same in the State Department. We have physicians and medical personnel that work at our embassies overseas to keep the community healthy. They're specialists. We have office management specialists, engineers that work on building our embassies and keeping our facilities running, and various other types of specialists. Really quickly, of particular interest to you all is probably internships and fellowships. Isaiah, can I introduce you? So Isaiah is a senior here at Boston College and a Wrangell Fellow, so a good person to talk to about how he got into that program. But we have Pickering and Wrangell Fellowships. They provide 2 years of graduate school and a summer internship for each of those 2 years, one in Washington and one overseas, followed then by a 5-year commitment to the Foreign Service. We also have, if you're interested in civil service, we have a Colin Powell Fellowship, which is very similar. It's 2 years of graduate school, but you do your internships in Washington, and then you have a civil service job when you're done, and a commitment to civil service at State Department. There are also fellowships for diplomatic security, another one of our specialists roles. So if you're interested in criminal justice, we have international federal law enforcement in our domestic security offices. That's the Clark Fellowship. We also then offer paid student internships, either a full year or a summer. If you're interested in the summer internships, that opens up actually the 1st of October, and it'll close in February. That would be for summer 2024. And the students live at Howard University, and they're provided both housing at Howard and then a salary for the work that you do on the internship. So those are fully paid, which is a great change we've actually been able to make in about the last year.
You can do those overseas too.
You can do
So
those overseas
you can work in
too.
London or Tokyo or Belize.
Be provided housing and a salary to live overseas and work in an embassy for the
It's
summer.
a long process, so you have to jump on it earlier, because it takes some time.
It's a great change, because back, only a few years ago, it was most internships were not paid. So most of the students who went overseas were students who didn't have to work for the summer or had an independent wealth they could use for that, which wasn't easy. So.
Yeah, and a lot of this information is at this website, careers.state.gov. It has all of the different breakdowns of the different careers, the different applications for all these different fellowships, internships, and so please look at that. The papers that we had out here, they all had careers.state.gov, because there's a lot more information that we can't cover in this talk.
Shall we, I don't know, we could just open up to questions. I'm sure there'll probably be a lot of questions. We could talk about some of the individual tours we did and different duties we had, different kinds of jobs back in Washington or in embassies. We also could talk about the orientation, how one begins as a diplomat, the things you learn in the initial classes, things like that.
The test.
Yeah, the exam too, yeah, exactly.
You want me, I can go
Yeah.
through the
Yeah,
exam,
we can
because
go
we
through the
just
exam.
changed it to
Yeah.
it. So the reason I'm doing this is my last tour was actually in the Global Talent Management, so our HR bureau, and so I worked on some of the internships and exams and things like that. So the Foreign Service exam, what you need to do is go to careers.state.gov and sign up to take the written exam. When you sign up to take the written exam, there'll be information on there as well on narrative statements that you need to write. They're basically essays that you write as part of the written exam. When you've submitted your essays and you've taken your written exam, those test scores are combined, which is also a new change. And then if you score high enough on those combined test scores, you're invited back to an oral assessment. Right now, the oral assessments are only happening in Washington, D.C., but within the next year, they're actually going fully virtual, so you'll be able to take those from anywhere.
And this is all free.
And
You
it's
just sign
all
up,
free.
you can
All
take
it
the
costs
test.
you is an afternoon to take the written test.
Yeah, and I actually have another BC alum friend who we were in Washington together, and he was interested in the Foreign Service, and so he took it 11 times, the exam. The 11th time he passed, and now he's had a great career at the State Department. So it doesn't cost you anything. Nobody knows how many times you took it. You just have to take it and try as many times as you need to.
I had a fellow on my staff at one embassy, and he had taken it 7 times before he got in, which is fine. And he would always go and he would tell people that a lot though in the first conversations he would have, and I said to him, you know, probably don't want to tell people a lot about that. And at one point, Secretary of State Clinton was visiting, and the lead on Secretary of State Clinton's travel came up to me and said, you know, what's with that junior officer over there? He was a little bit odd. And I said, what do you mean? I said, well, I know what you mean, but what do you mean? He said, well, I introduced myself, and he told me in the first sentence that he'd taken the Foreign Service exam 7 times before he passed. So, yeah, they don't hold it against you, but you don't need to advertise it necessarily.
Nowhere on your file does it say like took it 7 times, took it 10 times. You're in, just like anybody else. So.
Is the oral assessment, is it like an interview or is it an assessment of the information you need to know?
So there's no specific information you need to know. The oral assessment includes an interview, but then it also includes, they run you through some scenarios. And so it includes a group exercise to see, you know, how fast you think on your feet, how well you work with a group. It includes some individual exercises that they will run you through. There's no requirement to have studied anything in particular or have any specific base of knowledge. So it won't be an interview on what you know about international relations with country X or anything like that. It's all going to be to look at whether you display leadership, written and oral communication skills, the ability to negotiate, an analytical ability to think quickly on your feet and come up with options, to see trends. So they're going to look at a lot of different factors of how you conduct yourself during that interview.
You know, there was the one story about the one officer who got flustered. Do they still have the role-playing thing where you're taught your
Budget exercise.
Yeah, you're negotiating with Foreign Service examiners who are pretending to be officials from another country. And at one point, this may be apocryphal, but at one point, a would-be Foreign Service officer got too flustered. He declared war on the country that the people represented, which
Probably
was
didn't
a
pass.
problem for many different reasons. But yeah, I hope he didn't get into the service.
How do you do?
You had said that you work with migration, and how is that done in the State Department?
So my office, we have a Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration. It's a little bit of a different kind of bureau for the State Department. So we do humanitarian diplomacy, but then we are actually also the humanitarian arm of the State Department. So what I'm doing is I'm overseeing an office that funds UNHCR, International Organization on Migration, UNICEF, International Commission of the Red Cross, ICRC, and then also NGOs in the region. So we basically, as soon as a person becomes a vulnerable displaced migrant, which most anyone who is forcibly displaced immediately becomes vulnerable. As soon as they become a vulnerable displaced migrant in the Western Hemisphere, we work through international organizations and local NGOs to try to ensure that people have shelter, to try to find what we call durable solutions for people. So the first durable solution is there a solution in the country that they first enter from their home country? So if they are fleeing Venezuela, as over 7 million people have, is there a solution for them in Colombia? Is there a solution for them in Guyana, in Brazil? We work with those governments on their resettlement programs. Over 2.5 million Venezuelans are living in Colombia, and they've provided temporary protected status to those people. If that solution is not a durable solution for them, then they would enter potentially the U.S. Refugee Assistance Program or a refugee program to another country. But we're working on ways to try to prevent vulnerable people, especially families with small children, from crossing the Darien Gap, which is an area of jungle between Colombia and Panama. We do a lot of work to try to educate. We also, on the Panama side, when they've made it through that horrible trek, trying to provide medical assistance, trying to provide psychosocial help, because there are many awful things that happen to people and children and young women on that journey. So making sure we can provide that support. As the State Department, our support goes up to the Mexico side of the US border. And as soon as they enter a US point of entry or port of entry, they go to Department of Homeland Security, Border Patrol, US Immigration and Naturalization. That's where our part of the role ends.
You've got PRM officers also in different embassies.
We have, so I do the whole Western Hemisphere. We have 11 officers in 7 embassies in the Western Hemisphere.
What is the difference between an internship abroad and an internship in DC in the summer? Is one more competitive, less competitive, and also what does just the internship itself look like and how is it different?
Do you guys want to take?
Sure. So I would say, it depends. We've served abroad. We've served in Turkey, Russia, Nigeria, and I served in Canada. And so the interns that have come, they just had an interest in that particular country, and so maybe they already spoke the language. If you have an interest in Belize, and there could be an opportunity for you to work there. So that's up to when you apply, they'll kind of give you some options whether you want to be abroad or in Washington. Obviously, there's more positions in Washington because that's our headquarters. So when you apply for Washington, you could pick economic affairs where I work, or in Cheryl's office, and so there's different. You'll have more choices, but all centered around Washington. So it's really about what you're interested in, what kind of things you want to focus on. I mean, I tell people often in the Foreign Service, State Department, it's really a buffet table of different types of places and issues. We cover polar bears, we cover refugees. I work on supply chains and semiconductors, economic issues. We have so many different areas that we cover. So it all depends on what you feel like you want to do. We've changed our careers in the sense of in the State Department doing things that are totally different from what we did before. What you should talk about in Moscow. So we served twice in Moscow, and Cheryl's job was very unique, working in cultural affairs. Mine was very different. So I in Moscow worked on what we call environment, science, technology, and health issues. So that was dealing with the Arctic, for example. That meant polar bears, dealing with the native communities, the indigenous communities that share the Arctic, that Canada, the United States, Norway, Sweden, Finland, we all share the Arctic with Russia. And so I worked on environmental issues, waste management, and also worked a lot on science. So Russia has a lot of great science universities. They have a lot of scientists who come to the United States. We have a lot of Americans who go to Russia. When we were there, a famous person from the United States went to Moscow, who the Russians really wanted to see. This is in 2018. They really wanted to see him because he was well known. You all probably have heard of his name now. He wasn't that famous at the time. His name was Dr. Anthony Fauci. I was in charge of his trip and introducing him to Russians. Now he became obviously very famous as a result of COVID. But anyway, so that was interesting. You should talk about your cultural affairs.
Yeah. So Tony and I are actually both economic officers. But what I mentioned was, as a generalist, you can choose to work in any of the different specialties, any of the 5. So when we were in Moscow, I was the cultural affairs officer. I oversaw a team that designed programs to bring, when you hear about bringing ensembles or bands to a foreign country to do outreach, we did sports diplomacy. You might have heard about the U.S. Olympic soccer team. I think the women's soccer team did a program recently in Africa where they go and they talk to elementary school students and try to build knowledge of the game, but then also outreach to explain a little bit about what America is. So cultural diplomacy is really aimed at introducing our country to the average person in that country. So we would bring U.S. acts to perform in cities across Russia. We had English language programs. We brought speakers. We had a really good speaker that was a short film producer, and she came and talked about producing short films at a bunch of the arts institutes and film institutes across the country. And so we did lots of different programs, and we went to universities and spoke. We went and spoke at schools and tried to introduce really what it is, what it means to be an American, what our values are, and give a little glimpse into American society.
Yeah, I think it's one of the great things about about the career is that you get to do so many different things. So I was a political officer, still, I feel like I'm still a political officer. But like Cheryl and Tony, really I had a wide variety of things I did. I was a public affairs officer in one embassy, so I did many things that Cheryl was talking about, including media relations, arranging for the ambassador to have interviews or pitching a particular message we're trying to get across to that audience. But also even as a political officer, I mean, when I was in Poland, it was right at the time when Poland was joining NATO. So I did a lot of work with the Polish military as they were preparing for that. I also did a lot of work with the military when I worked with peacekeeping operations in the Balkans. And yet, when I was at the Vatican, I did most of what I did was more soft diplomacy. Some things even regarding migration that we talked about, human trafficking. So it's in a way it's difficult because you go to a new post, you go to a new job, and in a way you have to start fresh and you have to learn new skills. You have to understand the new country you're going to, and maybe you might have been there before, but maybe not. And there's not a lot of hand-holding when you get there. You got to dive right in, but it's exciting that way too. You know, every few years having a new challenge. I might just add one thing on the internships. I feel like, and maybe it might not be necessarily the case, but interns I've worked with in Washington, certainly great experience, and they got to know how the State Department works, headquarters, and that's a great thing. But overseas, I think there's more opportunity to do more things. Typically overseas, in certain embassies, the staffing might not be as strong, so they really need the interns to do a lot. So at the Vatican, for example, at the embassy there, we were a very small embassy, and yet covering the whole world because the Vatican is active all over the world. So, in terms of being interested in what was happening in different countries and engaging, so the interns we had, they were going to meetings with officials, with pretty high-ranking officials. They were helping to organize visits. We even had, because we were so short-staffed, we would even have them be control officers, maybe with some hand-holding for VIPs coming from the U.S. So I'm biased, but I would think being careful in choosing your embassy, especially maybe a smaller embassy, because, for example, the interns at Embassy Rome, there's an embassy to the Vatican, there's an embassy to the government of Italy, and oftentimes our interns at Embassy Vatican would talk to their friends who were interns at Embassy Rome, and they would find out they weren't doing nearly as much because it was a much bigger embassy, more people, so they didn't need them quite as much. But it's hard to tell.
When we arrived in Turkey, I was the deputy in the economic section, and we try as the Foreign Service to not have this happen, but it just so happened that the entire section was turning over that summer. And when I arrived, a week after I arrived, the last officer from the outgoing group left. And at that point, our summer intern had the most experience of anyone in the econ section. So she was getting to do quite a bit, and she and I were the only two in a normally 6-person section for about 3 weeks.
Yeah, and the intern program is really a recruitment for the State Department. Many interns end up joining both the civil service or the foreign service because they like the experience. And so it's definitely, if you want to get a taste of it, it's a great opportunity.
I'll say also, Tony, that I won't speak for Cheryl, but I think from you and I, the interns who then join the Foreign Service have a lot more Foreign Service experience than I had, certainly when I entered. And I think in general, as Tony I think alluded to earlier, students these days have many more internships and overseas experience, but when I came in, I didn't know much about state development.
Yeah,
Is there a certain year we have to be in college in order to do that embassy program, or like as a freshman would I be able to apply to that?
It's on the website, and I looked it over, and I'm trying to. I think headed into your sophomore year, I think you're eligible. You can't do it headed into your freshman year, but I think headed into your sophomore
anybody
year.
here, because you're already a student. Because it's next year. You're talking about.
It's summer 24. It's this coming summer.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, so that I would be.
But you can also do it, some schools, and I don't know so much at BC, but you can also do it in the fall, you do it in the spring. So at my office, we have an intern for the summer, for the fall, for the winter, and for the spring. So we have 4 interns rotating through during the year.
And, sorry, follow-up question on that, is let's say you're assigned to an embassy, would you have to learn to speak that language? Or as an intern, that's not required?
It's not required as an intern. It's a bonus if you already speak the language, and it would certainly help you in getting around, but it's not a requirement.
Yeah, and for many of the jobs, when you join the State Department and the Foreign Service, like we worked in Russia, we worked in Turkey, it's all built into when we bid on those or apply for those jobs that there's language training. So when I went to work in China, I didn't speak Mandarin, and so we have a language school in Virginia, and so they taught me Mandarin. Same thing with Turkish. We didn't know Turkish. We went there together. They taught us Turkish. Cheryl knew Russian already, but I didn't know Russian, so I had to learn Russian. And so my 26 years, I probably spent 5-6 years of it just in training, whether it's language or getting a master's or other trainings for the jobs that we do. So you got to like education and
Yeah.
learning a lot if you want these kinds of jobs.
If you, for the Foreign Service, and you said this earlier, but for the Foreign Service, if you like to know that on Tuesdays you're going to X restaurant and this is what you're gonna eat, and you like to do that every Tuesday and that's what you wanna do, don't join the Foreign Service, okay? If you like to go out and try new things and try something different and be challenged and moved outside your comfort zone and learn something new, the Foreign Service is great for you.
And I think another, one of the great things about it also is I think you get, because of the staffing issues and because when you're at a U.S. embassy in a different country, you have typically a lot more interests in that country than other embassies. So there's a lot of engagement at all levels. So you can be a junior officer, someone who's very new to the Foreign Service, and you're out there, you're meeting with pretty important government officials, you're meeting with civic leaders, you may be supervising some locally hired staff. So I think it's a great deal of responsibility that you get from a pretty junior position when you start, which is another great aspect of it, I think.
Obviously, these internships and fellowships are pretty difficult to get, pretty competitive. How would you differentiate yourself as a professional?
I'll just mention maybe a follow-up also to the other question. Unless they've changed the system, when we were choosing interns, we would see at the different embassies, we would see whoever put down, let's say, Embassy Warsaw as a potential interest, and we would see if that person had any Polish language, for example. So even though you don't have to have it, you're gonna probably want to pick that person with Polish language. You're gonna see the GPA. You're gonna see there's an essay.
There's
And
essays.
you can see if the person's a good writer.
Yeah, and I would say it also depends on like which place. So if you're interested in Paris, I think that'll be more competitive than in Ouagadougou or Benin or Bamako. So I don't think they get as many folks trying to get an internship in those embassies. So I think you should be thinking about that as far as how willing are you to be go into an adventure to someplace a little bit different.
I would say too, look at the internships and fellowships. You can apply to as many of them as you want. So cast a wide net, any of them you're interested, apply to them. On the application, there is a short essay. There's also room to answer like, what region are you interested in? And so explain, I'm really interested in sub-Saharan Africa or in, the Islamic Middle East. Because, and give them, I've taken these classes or I've, traveled there or whatever your reason is. Explain a little bit. Don't just kind of, I'm interested in this because I think it sounds cool. Like, give a real whole and fulsome answer as to why you have that specific interest.
Yeah, and I would say in reading these things that you don't tend to, you have people fill out, the minimum, but they don't tend to tell their story about why they have an interest in something. So that sticks out when you have kind of some personal reason for that place or that situation.
Is it still true that the internships for during the year are much less competitive than the summer?
Yes, during the year, yes, I would say that's correct. So in the fall, or in the spring coming, or in the winter, coming to Washington or going to abroad, it's less competitive than summer.
It seems you kind of describe a lot of these jobs as kind of like a revolving door where you're constantly moving to these different places. If you're in a country, in an embassy, and you really enjoy the country and you enjoy the work and you enjoy the culture and things like that, are there opportunities to settle down, maybe in one of these other countries at that embassy?
You can, most places you can extend by a year. But the idea is that they really don't want you to settle down, because in the Foreign Service, we're representing the United States and American citizens, and we're representing what it means to be American. So if you stay too long in one place, it's really easy to start to identify more with that place. And that's not what we're there for. We're there to be Americans representing America.
You can sometimes go back again to a different tour in that country, but that can also be difficult because there's so many variables. Like there has to be a job that's a job in your skill set, or a job that you're at the right level for, that's opening at the same time when your job you're in currently is ending. For example, as I said, I served in Warsaw. I learned Polish. My Polish got to be pretty good, and I was always looking for an opportunity to get back to Poland, because I love Poland. I love speaking the language, and interesting country. But there was never exactly something that lined up just right, so I never got back. On the other hand, I didn't plan on going back to the Vatican. I went to the Vatican on one tour. I wasn't planning on going back, but I was basically recruited to go back at a certain point, and I had the background and skills. So it can happen, but it's not.
Yeah, and it depends on the country. So if you love Mandarin and you want to work in China, we have 5 posts that you can rotate through in China. We have Chinese speaking places in Singapore, assignments, and other parts of Asia, and you can come back to Washington, work on Chinese issues, and then go back out to China. So I know people for like China, they have spent 15 years kind of back and forth in different cities, working in Washington on Chinese issues, and then going back to China. But again, different cities, and sometimes the same city. But China's a unique place. There's a couple other countries. Russia used to be like that. We used to have a lot of consulates in Russia, and in the Russian-speaking world, Central Asia, and then the Caucasus. You could use Russian in a bunch of different places where they're very similar.
You got to be careful though. Those, as you said, the one country languages can be more difficult. The one we have a BC student graduated last year who's really interested in the Balkans, and she's interested in the Foreign Service, and that's one sort of a little bit of a loophole with the Balkans, because if you learn Croatian and you want to go next to Serbia, the language is so close that you can get a little bit of training and go. But typically, those are the strategic issues you have to think about in your career.
I mean, Arabic is certainly, you can go, what's the difference between Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia? I mean, they're different, but they're close to each other. So if you want to spend a lot of time in North Africa, you could do that with Egypt, Tunisia, Morocco, maybe someday Libya again. So you can, there's certain areas you can specialize in if you want to. We should go in the back.
Oh yeah, maybe.
Way in the back there, in the white.
Thank you. What are the best ways to prepare for various components of the foreign or civil service exams?
Civil service, there's no exam. So you can apply either through the Colin Powell Fellowship or on USA Jobs. And there are links to USA Jobs on the careers.state.gov under the civil service topic. For preparing for the written test, it's largely like an SAT type test. There's a general knowledge portion, and then there's an English portion that looks at grammar and punctuation, just making sure for writing purposes. I would say for the general knowledge portion, what I've generally recommended to people is, I found a book at one point called Testing Your Cultural Literacy. What you want to find is something that gives you kind of short 1-paragraph answers. Don't worry about the test, read the 1-paragraph answers. What you're wanting to do is just remind yourself of things like, if there's a question on the Peloponnesian Wars, I would imagine everybody remembers hearing that word at some point in high school, but do you remember what they were, why it was important, and who was involved? And just the one paragraph answer will tell you that, and that would be enough then for generally a multiple choice question. So something like that to kind of help you remember some of the things you've learned about.
Could you describe your most interesting tour and then maybe also your most difficult?
Let's start with Peter.
Well, I'll say I loved all my tours. I enjoyed all of them. My first time I went back to Washington, everyone said, "Oh, you're gonna hate working back at the State Department. You're gonna hate working in headquarters." But I love those tours too. I mean, I'll give a little plug for my class that I think that my tour at the Embassy of the Vatican was. I mean, I loved all my tours, but that one was really fascinating because. The Vatican is such a particular place with such a interesting history, and the other element of it is that the Holy See is, as I was saying before, is engaged all over the world. So we'd be talking to the Holy See, trying to encourage them to mediate in Venezuela one day. The next day, we'd be talking to Monsignor who just got back from Iraq to get a lowdown on what was happening with the Christian community in Iraq. Then we might be working on a human trafficking project with some women religious. So and getting to meet and work with those top level Vatican officials is super interesting. I'd say in terms of most difficult, I mean, I think working back in the department, I think can be challenging. I worked in the Office of Western European Affairs at one point, and that's a very busy office because of our alliances with those countries and because there's a lot of visits from those foreign ministers and others. It's a lot of paper that you have to produce. So tons of briefing papers for the Secretary of State and for the other principals. So it was a lot of late nights working there, and the churn of creating those papers for the briefing papers is a lot of work. On the other hand, when you're sitting in a meeting with the Secretary of State and you see and you hear her using the words that you wrote, speaking to a foreign minister, that's kind of fun too. So.
I would say my most interesting tour, or the part of a tour that I found the most fascinating and exciting that I got to do, when we were in Turkey, I was in the economic section, and a small part of what I was doing to start out with was foreign assistance and closing out our USAID grants, because USAID had closed in Turkey a couple years before. That was right at the start then of the war in Syria, and so I was involved working with Turkish diplomats in their Ministry of Foreign Affairs to try to figure out two things. First of all, could we accredit non-governmental organizations to Turkey to work with the large numbers of refugees coming across the border? This was my first introduction to kind of refugees too. So I was able to work with them. The Turks don't typically like non-government organizations. It's an autocratic government, and they tend to worry that they're going to undermine their control domestically. So helping to convince them that these were legitimate organizations, that they needed their help to come in and run refugee camps and figure out how to do voucher systems and know how to do all of this. The second part of what we were negotiating at that time was President Assad would not allow humanitarian assistance into the north of Syria. And we had large amounts of the Syrian population that were not getting assistance. They were being bombed out, they needed medicine, they needed food. And so how could we take supplies and things that we had in Turkey and get them into Syria without violating international law? And we literally, four of us sitting around a table, designed a system where we pulled tractor trailer trucks up to the international border, and we transloaded onto Syrian tractor trailer trucks, and they went into Syria, and the Turkish trucks stayed in Turkey, and that way no one ever crossed the border. And we got assistance in. So that was the most exciting thing I got to do. Probably one of the hardest tours was cultural affairs in Moscow. The Russian government was very focused on shutting us down and preventing us from getting our messaging out. We had things like if someone came to an American center to hear a speaker, the Russian KGB, now the FSB, would stand outside and require every Russian citizen to give their passport and they would photograph it before people could come in to hear an American speaker. What was amazing was that we still managed to pack halls because people wanted to get information. They wanted to hear what Americans had to say, but the Russian government was just focused on shutting us down every way they could. And Tony can talk about it if he wants to, but we were both declared persona non grata in 2018 after only 7 months in our second tour in Moscow. So.
Yeah, I mean, the Russians, that last Russians, we were there 2 times. The first time was kind of a very positive time in the mid-2000s when Russia was part of the G8 and they hosted the G8, and so we were looking for Vladimir Putin to be a great supporter of Western civilization and rule of law. That didn't work out we had hoped, but when we were there in 2018, that was hard. We were told on a Friday night that Thursday night that we have to leave the country within the next 5 days. We had to go home and tell our family, our daughter, son, and my mother, who was living with us, that for the kids, that tomorrow's your last day of school because we got to leave and we got to pack up. We don't know where we're going. We don't know what we're going to do next, but we got to go because otherwise, if we stay here, we're going to go to jail. We don't want to go to jail, so it's time to go. So that was a bit difficult because we hadn't planned for all of that. Our moves, we do that with months and months of preparation, so we know where we're going next year or 2 years from now and things like that. So that was a tough one. I would also say we worked in Abuja, Nigeria, and so Nigeria is a very fascinating, dynamic, huge country, engine of many things in Africa, but also sometimes difficult if you're used to the internet and electricity and the phone working and drinking water and out of the tap. Like those are things you just can't do. So having to boil your vegetables and your things from the market, having to deal with terrorism, terrorist attacks, crime, and again, no electricity. Random situations like that. That was a bit, isolation. That was difficult for the family to kind of, okay, well, we have to, we're here to represent the United States. It's very important for us to be here, but there are some sacrifices. Disease, malaria, all kinds of other diseases are we had to take many shots, and our family had to take many shots in preparation, and then, take malaria pills while we were there for the 3 years to avoid, some of the other things, and so that was a lot more work to kind of be there and to do good work, and it was a great assignment. We got to do a lot of really cool things and see really cool things in advance, U.S.-Nigerian relationship, but it wasn't easy. It wasn't the same as in Turkey and some of the other places. One of the best jobs I had was actually a Washington, D.C. job, and I would say two jobs from Washington, where the first one I worked in our Bureau of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement. So this is a foreign assistance office that helps support building rule of law and justice around the world. So I focus on Africa and the Middle East, where they need a lot of support, and we're willing to help support. And I got a chance to go to Mogadishu, in Beirut, in Mauritania, in Senegal, and to Morocco, and to Egypt, and to Congo, and to Rwanda, and go and see how our U.S. taxpayer dollars is helping to support people who really needed that help and who are desperate for our help dealing with terrorists or the issues of rule of law. And so one of the parts of that was going to South Africa. I got a chance to work with this to go on safari and work, because we had a project with the rangers, the park rangers in South Africa, and so they're protecting elephants and rhinos and lions, and unfortunately these poachers that will kill these animals for their horns or their paws and things like that. And so we're trying to prevent wildlife trafficking. And so I got a chance to fly in a helicopter with the rangers to go into the deepest parts of the jungle to see these animals, and then work with them to try to catch the bad people. I went to a place where a poacher had killed a rhino and shot a rhino, huge animal, and had cut off the horn, just for the horn, killed the animal. And so we helped them better understand, kind of like a CSI episode of like how to track the bullet that was in the rhino, extract it, figure out how we can match it to a gun, and then hopefully catch the poachers. So when they, or to find the DNA that connects that rhino horn to somebody who's got it in their luggage someplace, trying to travel through an international airport, to catch them and to try to prevent them from killing these animals, and kind of fortifying the parks. And so that was a really cool job. Even though it was based in Washington, I get to travel quite a bit. In my current job, I get to travel quite a bit. I'm going to Brazil in a few weeks. I'll be in South Africa and Angola in November. I've been in Manila and Tokyo and Seoul and Vietnam, and working with folks on semiconductor supply chain. So it's really great to be able to kind of go out and see that people want to work with the United States. There's a lot of good things we can do, and this is all about public service. We're not here to make the most amount of money. We're trying to advance both the U.S. agenda and other people's agendas, and find ways that we can build bridges to work together. So that's a lot of fun.
I might say, Tony sort of references some things that can be a little bit dangerous too. We haven't really talked about that, but some of the jobs can be in countries where the security situation isn't so great, and so there is a little bit of that to think about sometimes too. The poacher, I didn't know about your poacher story. That's kind of interesting. But,
well, we were also in Turkey when there was a suicide attack on our embassy, and so Cheryl and I were both inside the embassy. I was going to leave, so I was exiting the embassy to go into our parking lot to get into a car to go to a meeting, and there was an explosion. A terrorist with a suicide bomb on him and grenades and weapons was trying to get in through one of our gates, and so fortunately our security people prevented him from entering into the compound. But when he couldn't get in, he detonated his the bomb and killed several folks, but one of our guards who worked at the embassy. And so that person saved us all, because if this guy had gotten in, he was going to go around and shooting people. And I remember it because I was outside and I heard the explosion, and I was like, when this happens, the way the embassy is set up is that all the doors and everything are like specially locked, so they're bomb proof, machine gun proof, stuff like that, so people can't get inside of them, so it's like a safe haven. But I was outside, and so I was like, I better get inside as fast as I could, because I didn't want to be like outside with the terrorists. I didn't know how many terrorists were running around the compound. Fortunately, it was just one, and he killed himself. But I'll never forget about, like, I need to get back inside, because I don't want to be out here and get trapped
And we had children who were in the British school at that point in Turkey, and the British school was located on the British embassy compound. So the other thing going through both of our mind was, okay, there's been an attack on the US embassy. What's happening at the British embassy? Because they were only about a half a mile away, and of course, if you're going to attack the Americans, who's the next folks you're going to attack? So we were worried about our kids. There was a lot going on. We were trying to account for our staff, and it was a lot. But I will say we're still very thankful. We, as Tony said, the local guard stood in the way of the suicide bomber. He protected and saved a lot of lives that day. The security, we had Marine security guards at the embassy. We had the full diplomatic security office at the embassy, and everyone there did exactly what they should have done in that situation. And we had a lot of people looking out for our security.
And I think there's a risk involved no matter what. You never know, no matter where you are. I made the mistake one time of when I was in Bosnia. I was working with the UN police in Bosnia, and we were funding the police, and they were going to do a raid on a place where they thought some trafficking victims were being held, and so they said, "Oh, you should come." So I said, "Okay, I'll go." And so I went, and then it turned out there was a lot of shooting in there. And as I was taking cover, I was thinking, I'm not sure I really needed to be exactly there. So maybe there'll be some risk that you can't avoid, some risk maybe you don't have to necessarily.
Well, sorry guys, but with that, we actually have to end. There's another group coming in here, and I think a lot of the questions are perspectives, so we need to let them get to class. But if you want to continue to ask questions, I'm sure that will stay around for a little bit. I want to thank them, and I hope that all of us are going to really pray and hope that the government doesn't shut down.
Yes.
Because that small salary that they get will be zero salary. So we're really hoping and pulling that they can get it together and you'll continue to be paid. But please join me in thanking